Today we have a special guest joining for an interview on the phone. He is a well-respected former diplomat with extensive experience dealing with Commonwealth issues. He has also worked in broadcast as well as a print journalist, someone who is often asked for advice by international think tanks. He is joining us today to share his views on the Commonwealth and specifically one of its member states, Sri Lanka. I'd like to welcome Sir Ronald Sanders, who is joining us on the phone from Barbados. Thank you very much for taking your time to be with us, sir. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Let me start off with some historical perspective. In 2003, Zimbabwe was suspended from the Commonwealth after Mr. Mugabe's government was accused of intimidation and vote rigging in March 2002 presidential elections. In 2007, Pakistan was suspended after the then president, Mr. Musharraf, failed to restore democracy to that country. These actions were all in line with the Commonwealth's key principle of democratic governance. So it is clear in the past the Commonwealth had to deal with rogue member states. In 2009, another Commonwealth member, Sri Lanka, was accused of massacring over 40,000 Tamil civilians by the state security forces. These are all UN figures. And today, there has been far more evidence that has come out via other media and Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International as well. Wouldn't it be appropriate the spotlight be shown on Sri Lanka for some answers this year?
Absolutely. And I think there are several Commonwealth countries, particularly the government of Canada, that is asking for these questions to be answered. Now, the Commonwealth stands and falls on its core values, declarations for which they say they stand about democracy, the rule of law, and respect for human rights. In the case of Sri Lanka, there is clearly evidence of human rights violations, of civil rights violations, and of the rule of law being severely under pressure. The Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, a group of 9 foreign ministers drawn from Commonwealth countries, are mandated to look at countries that violate the principles of the Commonwealth with a view to taking appropriate action against them. Now, there are several steps that they can take. The first one is to suspend them from the councils of the Commonwealth, which means they continue to be a member, but they cannot participate in its activities. The other is that they can be suspended altogether from the Commonwealth until they have corrected those deficiencies that are clearly demonstrable. And the third, of course, is expulsion. Expulsion would only come if a country is given an opportunity to correct its deficiencies and still does not do so. But there is clearly a case now for the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group to consider Sri Lanka in terms of both serious and persistent violations of Commonwealth values.
Mm-hmm. And you touched upon Canada earlier. Several attempts were made by Canada to include Sri Lanka on the agenda, citing a poor human rights record and to push for a change of venue for the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in November. However, a spokesman for Commonwealth Secretary General Kamlesh Sharma said that the meeting will be held in Sri Lanka as scheduled and that the island has not been included on the agenda for the next scheduled meeting of the CMAG in April. And this news came out recently on a website, thesundayleader.lk. And I also want to touch upon your recent article titled The Commonwealth Charter, Human Rights and Sri Lanka. You made a strong case of not having the Commonwealth Summit in Colombo, Sri Lanka. If this event is to be held in Sri Lanka under these circumstances, what kind of message and precedent does it set for the Commonwealth?
Well, it would be a very good one. And one would hope that Commonwealth heads of government would resist the idea of themselves attending the Commonwealth Summit if there is an insistence that it should be held there. Because any head of government who sits under the chairmanship of the President of Sri Lanka is indicating some acceptance of his role as head of state, as a legitimate head of state, without any violations of the Commonwealth Charter. And that would be a very awful thing to have happen. Now, if the President of Sri Lanka and the government of Sri Lanka were to demonstrate that they were interested in correcting the deficiencies that exist in the country by allowing an independent investigation into the allegations of human rights violations that have been made against them, and if they show themselves very willing to accommodate discussions of that kind and to take corrective action along the way, then there is still room to talk about whether the meeting should be held in Colombo or not. But unfortunately, that's not what we are seeing. What we are seeing instead is a stubbornness by the Sri Lankan government to insist that the meeting be held there, but not to take the kinds of appropriate action that would make people comfortable in going there under the chairmanship of President Rajapaksa. So, it's really, the ball is in their court. I suspect what might happen is if a number of developing countries who themselves are concerned about their own human rights issues were to insist that the meeting be held in Colombo in solidarity with President Rajapaksa, then I suspect what will happen is that a number of key heads of government will not be attending that meeting. And so the Sri Lankan government will be presiding over a meeting of some very important prime ministers not being present in Colombo. If that's the kind of meeting they want to have, well, that's the kind of meeting they will have. But it will, in any event, do severe damage to the credibility of the Commonwealth.
And do you think there's an uneasiness from member states to speak out on this?
I think there is by some. I don't think all of them are uneasy. But there are some. I mean, Canada's been in the forefront of speaking out. So the British parliamentarians have also spoken. But there are others who have other concerns. I understand, for instance, that the government of Australia is more concerned about refugees from Sri Lanka flooding into Australia, and therefore they need the cooperation of the government of Sri Lanka to try to stem that flow. And because of that, they are not willing to take on the Rajapaksa government. The fear, I suppose, is that if they do, then the government will do little or nothing to stop the refugee flow, and that will pose Australia with a problem. So, I mean, there are those kinds of bilateral considerations, but the truth of the matter is that if one is concerned about the Commonwealth as an organization which represents its member states and brings some and fortifies their own foreign policy positions and their standing in the world, then the Commonwealth is what should be protected at all costs. And I hope at the end of the day that is what will happen.
Okay, and one of the things you touched upon in your article was the impeachment of the Chief Justice of Sri Lanka by the Parliament. Many in the Western countries, including Canada, have raised concerns about the justice system and interference from the political establishments. Do you see this as a worrisome event, a trend towards undemocratic rule, if not already?
Well, and I think the impeachment of the Chief Justice was ruled by the Supreme Court of Sri Lanka itself as being unlawful and wrong and unconstitutional. On that basis, it should not have proceeded. One cannot impeach a Chief Justice of a country just like that. I mean, there are procedures that are set down for doing it. And when the Chief Justice is impeached by a body of parliamentarians in a government that didn't want the Chief Justice there, then it suggests that there was some collusion in this matter, and in any case, not followed. I don't think anybody will have a difficulty with an impeachment of a Chief Justice in any country if all of the legal and constitutional provisions were scrupulously followed, because it's a very serious thing to do. It seems clear here that none of these things were done, and the outcry against it from legal bodies all over the Commonwealth, has been quite loud. The fact that the government of Sri Lanka proceeded not only with the impeachment, but also to appoint to the position of Chief Justice a former Attorney General of the government, does not speak very well for the rule of law and for democracy. And I think the Sri Lankan government would have done itself a great deal of good had it reversed that impeachment procedure, and if they wished to proceed with it, then to do so in a manner that was legal, constitutional, and in keeping with the laid down procedures of how one deals with this, not only in Sri Lanka, but in Commonwealth countries as a whole.
The Commonwealth has always been known for having shared values, respect for human rights and rule of law among the member states. Do you think these common values are changing among the member states because of external economic interests from non-member states such as China and Japan influencing the region?
Well, I do think there is an influence of non-democratic countries in the world who are willing to back regimes that are themselves not democratic or increasingly moving in that direction. The great problem we have is that China, which is now the second largest economy in the world and has foreign reserves of $3.3 trillion, is not itself concerned about democracy and the rule of law in its own domestic affairs. So it can hardly be expected to try to impose that upon people outside. And the pattern has been that you take a country like Fiji, for instance, which is currently suspended from the Commonwealth. China continues to support the Bainimarama junta, the military government that took power by a coup in 2006, and continues to support them despite the aggravation of Commonwealth member countries in the area. So once that's happening, and these countries believe that they can turn to China and places like that for support, even though they are violating Commonwealth values, then I suspect some of them will do it. It then depends on what happens within the countries themselves. If the civil society decides that it wants those values to be upheld, then it is up to civil society to turn to its government and to say, look, we're not going to put up with these violations of democracy and human rights, and that is the kind of pressure that has to build up. But I think you are right. The fact that there are huge countries in the world now that are willing to support non-democratic regimes is not a good thing for the maintenance of values in the Commonwealth.
Sir Ronald Sanders, you served at various positions within the Commonwealth organization. Can you share your insights into how this organization works, who the influential players are, and how these decisions are made?
Well, I mean, the Commonwealth exists at several levels. It's not just the intergovernmental Commonwealth, which is what people mostly know. When heads of government meet or when ministers of Commonwealth countries meet, that's what people hear about because that's what makes the news. They also know, of course, about the Commonwealth Games because everybody likes sports and athleticism. But, you know, there is also an informal Commonwealth made up of civil society organizations of various kinds. There are lawyers, for instance, who belong to a Commonwealth Lawyers Association. There's a Commonwealth Magistrates and Judges Association. There's a Commonwealth Nurses Association. There's a Commonwealth Teachers Association. You know, the Commonwealth runs a full gamut of things in civil society. So it's not just an intergovernmental organization. But if you're asking me how they make decisions at the intergovernmental level, those decisions, I'm afraid, are made by consensus, not by a vote. The Commonwealth does not vote. It takes soundings. It comes up with what it believes is a consensus of opinion, and it tends to go with those consensus opinions because if they were to put some of these matters to a vote, then I'm afraid, unfortunately, some of the values to which the Commonwealth as it stands would find that the majority of its countries are voting against them. Which is a sad development, and it's why vigilance must continue on matters of democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. But the decisions are made by consensus at the levels of ministers and heads of government, so that if you've got a group of 54, 10 countries or so that are reluctant to go forward, then I'm afraid they could hold up the entire proceedings. Because while consensus does not mean unanimity, it does mean that a large number of the countries have to be persuaded of one idea. And if you have a significant number who are not, then it won't go forward. So, for instance, if you're asking me in the context of Sri Lanka, what would happen there? I suspect it depends on just how many governments are determined to be supportive of the Rajapaksa regime, despite all that has been said and all that is known, and despite the latest United Nations Human Rights Commission resolution. If there are a number of developing countries that feel they must nonetheless support the Rajapaksa government, then I'm afraid that's what's going to happen. But other governments who take a contrary view to that can show their own unease with it. And one of the ways they can show their unease is by not sending high-level representation to Colombo should the heads of government conference still be held there. In other words, you could have governments represented by officials rather than by heads of government or by ministers. And that would certainly send a clear signal to any government that wishes to host a meeting that there is great unhappiness by other governments about its behavior and actions.
And the concluding question, sir, is recently the Queen of England signed a charter for Commonwealth member states. Some people have questioned the vague statements in the charter, saying they are not specific enough in areas such as recognition of gender marriage equalities. Do you see this as a missed opportunity for the Commonwealth to embrace diversity, or are we going after a non-existing issue as far as member states are concerned?
Well, let me first of all say that the charter was signed by the Queen as the head of the Commonwealth. She didn't sign it as the Queen of England. And of course, the Queen is also the Queen of Canada, as she is of Australia and of New Zealand and of several countries in the Caribbean and the Pacific. She has 16 realms within the Commonwealth altogether. So she didn't sign it as the Queen of England. She signed it as the Queen, as the head of the Commonwealth and the symbol of the free association of its member states. Secondly, as to the quality of the charter itself, the charter merely is one document that has pulled together the essential elements of all of the declarations that Commonwealth governments have made since 1971 on democracy, the rule of law, and human rights. So it is a single document in which all of those values are captured. And yes, one can argue that there are some elements of it that are vague and not precise and not as clear. But in any organization in which you have 54 governments or more who have to decide on language, you will never ever get clear, precise language that you would like, let's say, in the constitution of a single country or the laws of a single country. Because what has to happen at the end is that these countries have to agree on what they consider are the things they hold to be sacred and sacrosanct. And those things have to be things in common. So what we've got is the best one can do if you're trying to pull together the views and attitudes of 54 governments. What I find sad about this particular charter is that it did not follow the recommendations of the eminent persons group who recommended that the charter should be established. Because what the eminent persons group had said is that the charter should be derived from a series of national consultations in every Commonwealth country, in which people in town hall meetings and civil society groups and even in parliamentary debates were able to contribute to what they think that charter should encompass. That consultation process in each of the Commonwealth countries did not take place, except in 3 of them, and I thought that was a shame. But in any event, the point is you now got a charter, and inasmuch as people may criticize it for its language not being precise, the reality is that charter is a charter to which governments are now going to be held accountable by their own populations and by people outside of their own countries. So one has to hope that the charter will now become something to which governments are going to have to work very hard to upkeep, and that others will ensure they are held accountable for.
I see, right. And that about wraps it up. Sir Ronald Sanders, once again, thank you for taking your time for speaking to us today regarding the Commonwealth and the issues surrounding Sri Lanka. We appreciate your time, and we bid you a safe trip.
Thank you very much indeed.
And to our listeners and viewers, you can read the complete article written by Sir Ronald Sanders on www.huntingtonnews.net/57528.